Tēnā koutou katoa. Those who founded this venerable church more than 160 years ago might be a little disturbed that the Archbishop of Canterbury should be introduced into it. However, my intention is not so much to be ecumenical as to recall a debate in economics of a mere 60 years ago in which the ethical dimension of an economic question was symbolised by the Archbishop. The different context, it could have been a moderator, the Vicar of Rome, or for that matter a chief rabbi, an imam, or the leader of any other religious faith, or even a minister of your local church. The point is that such people have an ethical comparative advantage over economists. The incident which precipitated the issue involved economist Dennis Robertson. Although not well known today, I used one of his textbooks as a student. He was an eminent professor of economics at the University in Cambridge in the 1930s, when it had the most important economics department in the world. And he was knighted for his services to economics. It may also be relevant to mention that Sir Dennis was the son of an Anglican clergyman. Among his contributions to economics was an article, Utility and All That, in which he pondered on the issue of interpersonal comparisons of welfare in economics. From early days, economics had been based on the utilitarian assumption that the greater consumption generated higher welfare. There are a number of caveats to this conclusion which economics takes into account, but as a general rule we assume a person is better off with a higher income. The justification for using per capita GDP arises from this assumption. The problem which concerned Robertson was, what if a rise in one person's income made other people feel worse off? Where envy was widespread, it was possible that, in a certain sense, a rise in one person's income could reduce the welfare of the public at large. What were economists to do? Well, in his 1954 paper, Robertson argued that economists should assert as a plain matter of fact that economic welfare undoubtedly will be increased in the event of somebody receiving higher incomes, then call in the Bishop of Canterbury to smack people over the head if they're stupid enough to allow the increased happiness which might be derived from this plain fact to be eroded by the gnawings of the green-eyed monster. As an aside, if economists are to discount envy, are they not also to discount altruism? My theme that interpersonal utilities, envy and altruism, generate the most profound problems for economic analysis. For instance, another eminent economist, James Tobin, was shown that the standard propositions about how the market works are not true where there's a widespread envy or altruism. In particular, self-seeking does not necessarily lead to the public economic benefit. If pressed, most economists would mutter about that the rising tide lifts all boats, and if everyone had a higher income, there'd be no increase in envy, but there would be a rise in general welfare. Robertson would have added some caveats, but would not have been uncomfortable with that conclusion. In summary, economists are driven by a belief that more means better. Observe here that the issue is one of normative economics, of welfare comparisons, of how we evaluate economic outcomes. It does not ask whether envy and or altruism is a significant factor in economic behaviour, whether the bishop's bouts of head-smacking have had any effect. Until recently, economists were unsure how even to investigate the question. However, in the post-war era, and especially in recent years, data has been collected which throws some light on this issue. Suppose you ask people whether they're happy. The reply involves a subjective response, and economists are uneasy about such subjectivity, but there are other measures of happiness, including biological ones, which show similar patterns to that which I'm about to report. So I think we can proceed on the basis that self-rated subjectivity reflects some objective reality. What do the replies generally tell us? There are lots of fascinating results, including happy countries tend to be richer countries. More important for happiness than income are social factors like the strength of social support, the absence of corruption, and the degree of personal freedom. Unemployment causes as much unhappiness as bereavement or separation. At work, job security and good relationships do more for job satisfaction than high pay and convenient hours. Behaving well makes people happier. Mental health is the biggest single factor affecting happiness in any country. Stable family life and enduring marriages are important for the happiness of parents and children. In advanced countries, women are happier than men, while the position in poorer countries is mixed. And happiness is lowest in middle age. I'll come back to these later. Initially, I'm going to focus on two major findings. The longest series we have on happiness is from the United States. Since 1946, they've been asking people whether they're happy. The survey is a consequence of Congress responding to the Declaration of Independence, which states, all men are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So for 70 odd years, Americans have been dutifully carrying out the surveys. In that time, per capita GDP has risen by more than 3 times. In contrast, average responses to the happiness question are much the same today as they were in 1946. Despite rises in real incomes over time, there is no corresponding rise in people's self-assessed happiness. More does not necessarily seem better. Yet, apparently paradoxically, if you ask a group of people at any point in time whether they are happy, you'll find those on the higher incomes say they're happier, and those on the lower incomes are less happy. So if my income goes up, I'm happier. If everyone goes up, I'm not. Such a conclusion is threatening to the conventional wisdom. Inevitably, it's been challenged. Some of the challenges are simply deniers who say the finding can't be true. They also are against climate change. The more sophisticated argument is that the question is misleading, but methodologically, however, their argument is circular because they do not draw on independent evidence. One empirical argument is whether it is true that communities with higher incomes are or are not happier. Now, it turns out that in poor countries, let's try and get this right, on the left there, in poor countries, they have very low happiness. And a rise in average incomes, you can see it going up, are associated with greater happiness. So as say Bangladeshis, who live in one of the poorest countries in the world, get richer, they're also happier. The contrast with the rich United States, which is at the top here, it's not had a rise in average happiness for as far back as we can measure, despite rising incomes. We can resolve the paradox by concluding, we can resolve the paradox by concluding that if a community is really poor, its members do feel happier as their standard of living rises. If your food, clothing and shelter isn't adequate, you do feel genuinely better if you have more of them. but at a certain threshold, when adequacy is reached, additional consumption does not add to your happiness. And in mathematical terms, we see it there that the relationship's non-linear. It rises for low levels of income, it flattens out for high levels. Note that when the foundations of the economics discipline were laid in the 19th century, even in Britain, the richest country in the world, many people's consumption was far from adequate. And it's a reasonable hypothesis that more meant better for them. But British living standards have since well passed that threshold, and they, like the US, don't get a boost in happiness from a boost in income. Nor do we. How high is the threshold? Well, it's difficult to measure exactly, and it may change over time, but currently it appears to be about 2/3 of the average New Zealand income. So we join the US and the Britain, and indeed most OECD countries, in that higher average incomes do not raise average subjective welfare. Because some poor countries have moved up closer to the adequacy threshold, the world seems to have become a little happier in the last 30 years. Economic progress seems to have done some good. Now, the remainder of what I'm going to say today is about rich countries above the threshold, with one exception. There is nothing I'm about to say which changes such obligations we have, or may think we have, to enable poor people in poor countries to have a standard of living above the threshold. To get them to the state where their income increases, they remain about as happy as average. So there's nothing I'm going to say about poverty in the developing world today. So I return to my main theme. In rich countries, more for everybody does not seem better. Certainly they're not happier. However, another paradox, to have more relative to others in your community does increase your happiness. So, as a result, people will strive to lift their incomes relative to their fellows. But not everybody can do that. Ironically, if we succeed in raising our incomes, we're not all happier. It's a bit like when we used to sit on benches at rugby matches. When the game got exciting, we all stood up to see better. But of course, if we all stood up, we did not see any better. Similarly, if we each stand up for a higher income to make us happier, we do not seem to get any happier. But, and this seems crucial, I've just described a mechanism which generates material economic growth, raising the material standard of living. So I've just described how seeking your own benefit raises our material standard of living without raising our happiness. People strive to improve themselves, and that raises material standards of living. The differences of the story I'm telling from economic orthodoxy, which goes back 250 years actually to Adam Smith, is that a rise in material standards no longer seems to increase general welfare. You'll now have a sense why many traditionally trained economists are so vehement in their dislike of the outcomes of the happiness research. You'd think they might be happy. Why are people on relative incomes happier than those on higher relative incomes happier than those on lower relative incomes? 20 years ago, some of those on relatively high incomes then had a material standard of living comparable to the incomes of today's relatively poor. 20 years ago, that income made a person relatively happy. Today, exactly the same standard of living makes a person relatively unhappy. One mechanism to explain the strange state of affairs is the Robertsian one of envy. People on high incomes are happy, and people on low income would be equally happy if they were not envious of the better off than they are. If it were true, the bishop should smack them all on their heads, apparently curing them of envy. I don't know if it's a recommended cure, but with the result their happiness would rise, presumably as soon as their headaches were over. But there exists Another not unrelated explanation, perhaps incomes are associated with social status. A high income has others looking up to the rich, giving them attributes which are not justified by any talent they have, but for the high incomes they have. Remember Tevye, from Fiddler on the Roof, sing about were he a rich man? No, I'm not going to sing, it's safe. Oops. The most important men in the town would come to fawn on me, that asked me to advise them, like Solomon the Wise, if you please, Reb Tevye, pardon me, Reb Tevye, posing problems that would cross a rabbi's eyes. And it won't matter one bit of difference if I answer right or wrong. When you're rich, they think you really know. Certainly many of our rich are not loath to impart their wisdom to us all, trite and self-serving though it may be, apparently on the basis that wealth gives them special insights. I need to add, however, that celebrities of any hue make the same claim, not just the exceptionally well off. Because money enables one to exercise public power and to purchase acquiescence, those who possess more of it have a status in society. Given the higher status generates higher self-esteem, the rich are happier. As Bob Dylan said, money does not talk, it swears. Of course, the rich have to demonstrate their wealth. I can remember the time, say 30 years ago, when it was not polite to boast about it. There's still huge houses, but they were then hidden by modest fences. And many of you will know there's a house quite close here which actually looks quite modest from the fences, but I suspect is very luxurious within. And as I understand it, such people made generous donations, but the donations were anonymous. The permitted way of establishing in public that one was well off was by, do you remember? Grumbling that one paid an awful lot of tax. When top income tax rates fell, the grumbling ceased. And after all, given the generosity of the tax cuts to the rich, it would be impolitic to draw attention to them. New ways had to be found to display one's wealth. I do not know what the exact mechanism which led to the change, but it's evident that about a quarter of a century ago, conspicuous consumption became more common. Houses became ostentatious, and the most ostentatious people had 2 or 3 of them. Trophy wives, inexpensive fashionable clothes began to appear in our gossip magazines. Gatsby parties were thrown with much media attention. More honourably, the rich continued to make large donations to worthy causes. Most noticeably in New Zealand, this has been supporting creative activities. But unlike many other countries, there's very little for the promotion of high-quality public debate, which may explain why the nation is doing better in the arts and literature than it is intellectually. However, the big difference in these donations compared to 25 years ago is the generosity was accompanied by prominent mention of the donors' names. More generally, my impression is that not only did the policy changes of that period make major changes to the way the economy operated, but there was a fundamental change in society. It's not been well explored. Economists can only go so far, and sociologists have yet to start to address it. We know there was a rapid increase in inequality, but my impression is that there was a change in the texture of society as well. Although other phenomena, such as the rise of the earning mother and the consolidation of the urban Maori, also had a major impact. The Economist Choir Economists observes the rise of conspicuous consumption and allied changes as a fact about economic behaviour. Perhaps they feel a little more inhibited about applying welfare economics, but ultimately it's a shrug of the shoulders and this is the way things work. At which point the Archbishop or some religious leader steps in. A good place for them to start is, how is it that we value some people's economic efforts more than others? Economists might respond by pointing out there's a difference between value and price. The facts are that some people's work effort is remunerated more by the market than others. They are paid a higher market price, but that is not the same thing as value. But, says our Archbishop, why do you pay the head of the Ministry of Health more than those who look after our elderly in our residential homes? Surely the carers are doing more valuable work than the administrator. Economists have thought about this problem a lot, albeit with a different example. Even as an economics student, I was confronted with the question why we value diamonds more than water, whereas water is obviously more valuable to our well-being. It's partly a consequence of playing on the two meanings of the word value. I could rephrase the question, why is the price of diamonds higher than the price of water? To simplify, the answer is that diamonds are scarcer than water, just as senior administrators are scarcer than residential home workers. That price reflects their scarcity, not their value. I'm just about to explain the alternate meaning of the word when the Archbishop jumps in and asks, why do we equate price with value? The short answer is that 200 years ago, economists were confused by the two terms and lumped them together. Even today, in the jargon of the profession, what we should call price theory, we call value theory. But we did sort it out. Everything else 200 years ago was equally muddled, but while we sorted it out about 100 years ago, the general public still has not. Our Archbishop persists. Why do we equate value with price? Does it mean that high-priced workers contribute more to society than low-priced ones? And so that makes them more valuable. A well-trained economist gets very embarrassed at this point. It turns out there is a sense in which high-priced workers contribute more to the economy, and of course the economy isn't the whole of society, is it? But, Your Grace, but because there's, however, the justification is circular. The theory slips in the assumption that workers are valued by their price. So we put in the assumption that workers are valued by their price, and then we demonstrate that workers are valued by their price. For economists cannot properly equate value in this sense with price without adding an assumption which does not come from economic science. The point is, Your Grace, that economists can progress the analysis only so far, and they've reached the point where they can go no further. The Archbishop looks puzzled. He says, this is not what we hear in the public debate. Well, many of who pronounce on the economy are not trained economists. It's a bit like in religion. All sorts of untrained experts pronounce on eternal truths, quite unaware of the subtlety of theological discourse. Do I see the Archbishop smile? Many in the debate are self-seeking or representing the interests of those who pay them. Sadly, too, the issues I've been raising are so hard that they are put aside. My impression is that many of today's economists are not taught them. Certainly, we do not teach methodology as we once did. It's a bit like getting a religious training without any theology. So we just take it for granted that more means better, that the purpose in life is happiness from higher material standards of living. You, Your Grace, may want to challenge that assumption. Actually, there was a major economist who did, but he was also a very important philosopher. It was in that role I first read John Stuart Mill, and about 150 years ago, he had been asked by the utilitarians, who included his father, to provide a rigorous foundation for their theory, which, and remember, utilitarianism is the aim, is the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. In the end, Mill undermined the utilitarian series when he wrote, "It's better to be a human dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. And if the fool or the pig are of the different opinion, it is because they only know their own side of the question. The other party to the comparison knows both sides. Economists found that Mill's challenge so difficult that they've tended to keep happiness as an objective. And you could argue that the Rogernomics changes 25 years ago were predicated on producing happy pigs. Whether the pigs ended up any happier is a matter for another occasion. So allow me, Your Grace, to continue with the notion of the ultimate purpose is happiness. Although when you come to lecture here in your own right, I shall be all ears as to what might be a better purpose and how economists might contribute to it. So let me go back to the research which listed the correlates with happiness. There are certainly some others, but we don't have the evidence to be sure of them. Here are those factors which affected happiness. I gave you a bit earlier, but here is in different order. First, we know age and gender matters, but even archbishops can't do a great deal about them. Second, there are factors like the strength of social support, the absence of corruption, the degree of personal freedom, stable family life and enduring marriages, behaving well and quality mental health. These are all factors to which archbishops may make a contribution, but economists certainly do not. Third, job security and good relationships at work do more for job satisfaction than high pay and convenient hours. There are important issues which economists can say something about, although modern economic theories may be not much help because it says that pay will compensate for poor job security and poor work relationship. There's not a lot of evidence that it does. In parenthesis, you will notice that those with the lowest job security and the poorest work relationships are paid lower than others, not higher. The final group of factors which affect well-being are unemployment and sufficient income to provide an adequate standard of living. These are economists' concern, but as I explained, already in rich countries we have generally hit the threshold of an adequate income. So all that leaves economists to do is to focus on unemployment. Except to tell the world what's going on, something we're very good at, providing you don't look at our past record. Now you may think that the economic conclusion from all this is that rich countries should give up economic growth, it's okay, since it's not contributing to people's happiness. I'm afraid it's more complex than that. First, as I explained, economic expansion is driven by individuals striving to better themselves. Suppose New Zealand was to give up economic growth, then many New Zealanders would go overseas to strive there. Humiliatingly, they would come back, and to boost their self-esteem, they would lord it all over us at how well they've done. It already happens. So we cannot avoid the world outside. But if for some reason world economic growth stopped, and let us not forget there are billions below the standard of living threshold, so we would be then condemning them to eternal unhappiness. Science would continue to progress and the resulting technology, new scientific applications would continue to raise productivity and perforce reduce employment. This could mean more leisure, but almost certainly the impact would be uneven and unemployment would occur for some, and they of course would have reduced happiness. Now, I'm not saying that economic growth is inevitable. There have been alarms about the world running out of resources and stagnating, or worse, going back to Thomas Malthus. That's over 200 years ago. In the following 200 years, it has not happened, primarily because technological progress has been a substitute for scarce resources. Obviously, one day Malthus is going to be right, but we don't know when. A more serious problem for the rich world is that while productivity continues to rise, real incomes may not, because the relative price for their products fall. The good news is beneficiaries from the fall. So if we have increased productivity, no increase in our incomes, the good news, thank you very much, the good news is that it will be the poor of the world who would benefit, as is already happening in East Asia. Now, do I hear the Archbishop saying with exasperation, once more you economists are going on about the next world, mainly because you can't know whether you're right or wrong, and when you do find out, you'll be forgotten. What I have to deal with is the here and now. I think what economics says about the present is that we have to be a lot more careful about evaluating progress. Some makes us better off, and we need to give a greater focus on them than just promoting more material production. One example is improved healthcare, another is the creative arts. More generally, another great economic philosopher, Amartya Sen, has argued that we should pay more attention to what he calls capabilities, to life choices. Certainly, a society which stunts the future opportunities of so many of our children could be improved considerably. But because I'm running out of time, I'll leave that to another day. So what is the role of an archbishop? The message is that the economy needs more moral leadership. I don't mean technical discussions on what is happening. Rather, economists need more help on how to evaluate the performance of the economy. And so does the public. They, as well as economists, have been trapped into thinking that what matters is material output. Whatever the purpose of existence, economic growth in an affluent society is probably not closely related to it. Although it will be happy to it will happen to some extent, and it would be sensible to harness that growth for higher purposes. So, Your Grace, you might emphasise the measure of man or woman is not their income. It may be well more important how they spend it, especially how much they give to others, including through taxation to the public chest. For often that's the best way of actually raising public welfare. An earlier religious leader, you'll know of Jesus' teachings, sir, but how little they impact on modern society. Told the story of the widow's mite. Jesus sat over against the treasury and saw how the people cast money into the treasury, and many that were rich cast in much. Then came a poor widow, and she threw in 2 mites. He called to him his disciples and said, "Truly this poor woman has cast more in than they which have cast into the treasury. For all they did cast is of their abundance, but she of her want did cast in all that she had, even all her living." The bishop has a puzzled smile. You're really arguing for independent utilities, are you not, Brian? Yes, Your Grace. But the opposite way round to what concerned Robertson, against envy and for altruism. But you said, Brian, that would muck up economics. So be it. We should not run the world to suit economists. The purpose of life is not set by them. Our role is to understand the economy, but also to help it meet society's needs. Others have to determine what those needs are. We are servants, not masters. Just like archbishops, even more than archbishops, Your Grace.